He exhaled once, thin and fluttering, and the room went so quiet the oxygen concentrator sounded like a distant shore. The lawyer cleared his throat. The housekeeper pressed a hand to her chest, and I set down the morphine dispenser like it might shatter the floor. Per the will. Attorney James Mitchell announced, Mr. Terrence Hawthorne leaves everything to the daughter he was forced to give up decades ago. Then he turned to me, his gaze oddly tender and surgical at the same time, and asked, "What is your full legal name?" I felt the world tilt, the chandelier sway, the past come running. Let me back up. 3 days earlier, I answered a classified ad for a live-in caregiver, the kind of notice you clip because the font itself looks like hope. I was 62, a widow whose savings had evaporated one hospital bill at a time, and the line that said housing provided made something old and stubborn in me lift its chin. The Hawthorne mansion rose from 5 manicured acres like a judgment, all stone and shadow and ironwork. At the door, the housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, brisk and careful, tucked a stray hair behind her ear and whispered, "He's driven away 12 caregivers in 2 years. Don't take anything personally." I smiled because smiling is how you keep from trembling. Inside, the smell was wax and cedar and the faint chemical ghost of antiseptic. He was a narrow geometry of bones and willpower in a hospital bed set beneath a window that faced a garden too immaculate to be accidental. "You're not what I expected," he rasped, and his eyes alert. Appraising mapped my face like a cartographer sketching a coastline. "Most people aren't," I said, fluffing a pillow, measuring his breath, pretending this wasn't the richest address I'd ever stepped into. "That's what makes life interesting." He smiled then, quick and genuine, the first and last time I'd see his guard drop without a fight. The job paid better than anything I'd touched in years, enough to imagine a future measured in choices rather than coupons, but Terrence Hawthorne was exacting in a way that lived beneath language. He cataloged routines, he watched me pour water, he asked for books about lost families and then watched me reading them to him, a faint warmth pinching the corners of his eyes. Some nights, when the light went soft and the machines hummed steady, he'd say, "Tell me about when you were little," and I'd give him these small, harmless pieces, my third-grade teacher's silk scarves, my mother's lemon bars. The winter our pipes burst while the old man's stare turned almost devout. "You remember details," he'd murmur, like it meant something. By the end of the first week, Mrs. Chen pulled me aside, drying her hands on a linen towel the way anxious people dry their hands on their own worries. "He likes you," she said. "That's good. But he asks, personal." I shrugged. Loneliness loosens the tongue. I'd learned that in hospital corridors at midnight. Still, there were moments when he studied me like I was a photograph he'd once seen and couldn't quite place, the edges smudged, the center bright. Which brings us to that final afternoon, the mahogany-paneled study as staged as a scene in a play velvet chairs, a decanter ambered with something expensive, the lawyer and his sharp-eyed assistant, Patricia, in a posture that said condolences and consequences. Terrence's chest had gone still. We were inside the silence that comes after. Mitchell's voice was calm, stone, skipping across a black lake as he read the provisions. And then he fixed on me. "What is your full legal name?" he asked. And the question arrived like a key, sliding toward a lock I'd cemented shut decades ago. "Margaret Collins," I said, measuring each syllable. "Why?" He exchanged a look with Patricia, the sort of look professionals share when there is no elegant way to open a wound. "Because there is something Mr. Hawthorne discovered about you that changes everything." When I asked what that meant, he opened a folder thick with the paper cuts of other people's choices. "Were you born on March 15th, 1963? He asked gently. And my blood ran cold because I hadn't written that date on any employment form since I learned how to reinvent myself. From there, the world narrowed to names and places I had sealed away: Hartford General Hospital, a birth mother listed as Jennifer Walsh, 16, a father recorded as unknown. Patricia's voice was careful as she explained that Mr. Hawthorne had hired investigators the day I arrived. He'd recognized something: my face, my mannerisms, the way I answered questions, and he'd followed instinct with money and time. I wanted to say there had to be a mistake, that my adoptive parents told me a different story. Sarah, 22, college student, one bad decision and good intentions. But Mitchell slid across a black and white photograph, a young man with fierce eyes beside a pregnant girl who wore my nose, my stubborn chin, my future. "This is Jennifer," he said, "and this is Mr. Hawthorne, 1962. The room blurred to a tunnel. Outside. Somewhere. A clock ticked like a heartbeat you can't forget. I said there had to be a mix-up, that names get recycled and faces play tricks, that grief makes people reach for impossible stories. But Patricia slid another folder toward me like a dealer laying down the inevitable card and said, "We understand this is overwhelming, but the documentation is thorough. Inside were copies of adoption papers, hospital logs, notarized letters, my life translated into stamps and signatures," while Mitchell murmured, "According to these records, Jennifer Walsh delivered a baby girl on March 15th, 1963, placed immediately for adoption through Catholic Charities to Paul and Ellen Collins. I wanted to insist my parents would never have lied, yet the protest crumbled even as I formed it because I knew what the era did to secrets." "Adoption records were often softened for children," Patricia said, her voice careful as gauze. "Names altered, ages adjusted. They believed a kinder story would hold better." I stared at the photo again, the fear and resolve in the girl's eyes, the fierce claim in the boy's stance, and felt a tremor run through the scaffolding of the person I'd built. "What happened to Jennifer?" I heard myself ask, surprised at how quickly the name felt like a thread I'd always kept in my pocket. Mitchell's gaze lowered. "She died in a car accident 6 months after giving birth. She'd been driving to see the baby to see you when it happened. The word you landed and bloomed into something unbearable. For a few breaths, the study's paneled walls felt like a box closing. And then, Patricia added softly, Mr. Hawthorne searched for you for decades. He never stopped. I thought of his evening requests for reunion stories, the way his eyes changed when a lost child was found, and a terrible tenderness rose up like a door I hadn't known was locked, opening into a room full of light and dust. If this is true, I said, each syllable a step onto a floored bridge. Why didn't he tell me? Why hire me and pull threads instead of saying the words? Mitchell opened a slim envelope sealed with the restraint of a man who understood time was running out. He anticipated that question. He left you this. It was his handwriting, angular, impatient, familiar from the notes he scrawled about medications addressed to me. Dated 3 months earlier at exactly 7:30 p.m. My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then I've gone and you are finally learning what I never managed to say. You are my daughter. I hired you because I needed care. Yes, but mostly because I needed courage. And it came in the form of you telling me about lemon bars and burst pipes and the way you pause before you answer hard questions. He wrote about Jennifer's laugh, the pressure from his family, the way regret becomes a country you emigrate to by accident and can't quite leave. He wrote that he was proud of me, kind but not weak, strong but not cruel, and that whatever I chose to do with this truth would be mine to decide. And then the line that made my hands shake so hard the paper rustled, I've left you everything, not to buy forgiveness, but because it has always belonged to you. I don't know how long I sat there with the letter folded against my chest before Patricia slid over a small velvet box, its hinge delicate as a sigh. "He wanted you to have this first," she said. Inside was an antique gold locket engraved with JW, the surface worn smooth by years of nervous thumbs. I opened it with the caution you use when waking a sleeping child. On the left, Jennifer smiled with a hand over her round belly, radiantly alive in a way that felt like a promise she'd tried to keep. On the right, a newborn swaddled tight, a cleft of a chin that looked like mine even at hours old. There was a paper, folded so many times the creases had become memory for my baby girl. "You are loved more than you will ever know. I'm sorry I can't keep you safe myself. Mama." The word loosened something locked in my ribcage, and I cried the way a storm finally lets go after a long, airless heat. When I could breathe again, I whispered, "How much is everything?" It sounded vulgar as it left my mouth, and yet we all understood that grief and arithmetic often arrive together. Mitchell, steady and precise, consulted a page. The estate is valued at approximately $47 million, plus the primary residence, art collection, and several business interests, bringing the total to roughly $63 million. The laugh that tore out of me bordered on feral half-disbelief, half the exhaustion of a woman who had counted pennies at pharmacy counters. I was someone who took the bus to shift work and compared brands of canned soup, and now a fortune with a coastline and weather system had been placed in my hands. The box was still open in my palm, the locket warm from the heat of my skin, and for a flicker of a moment I felt not rich, but located, like a compass that had stopped spinning. Mitchell cleared his throat. "No conditions," he added, anticipating the dread that curled up like cold smoke. Mr. Hawthorne was adamant. "You inherit by right and by love." I thought of dinners he'd insisted we share, of the way he listened without anchoring my words to his own, of the hope threaded through every "tell me about when you were little." He had been rehearsing a confession while teaching me, without saying it, what it meant to be his daughter. Outside. The light shifted across the lawn like an hour passing, and I realized a different kind of hour had turned inside me, the kind that divides a life into before and after. I closed the locket and felt the click like a vow. Then, with the letter in my bag and the weight of a new name settling in my bones, I asked to see his room. The air in his room still carried the faint scent of eucalyptus and morphine, that sterile sweetness that clings to endings. The machines were gone, leaving only the soft impression of their presence, the indented carpet, the empty space beside the bed. I crossed the room quietly, afraid to disturb the hush that felt almost alive. On the nightstand sat a photograph of Jennifer Walsh, her face turned slightly toward the window as if she'd been waiting all this time for me to arrive. Next to it, a stack of worn books about family reunions and adoption stories, each one underlined, annotated in Terrence's sharp hand, and on the bulletin board above his chair, the newspaper clipping for the caregiver ad I'd answered 6 months ago. It hit me then that none of this had been chance. Every detail, every moment of shared silence, every question he'd asked had been part of a long, careful design. He'd built a path that would lead me here back to him without scaring me away. I sank into the chair by the window, the same chair where he'd spend his final afternoons watching the light fade across the garden. Outside, the autumn leaves were pale gold, whispering against the glass. I thought of all the stories I'd told him, the small truths about my life I'd offered without realizing what he was really hearing. He'd been listening to his daughter without daring to name her, afraid the word might break the spell of our fragile peace. Now, surrounded by the remnants of his patience, I whispered, "You found me, and felt the weight of 62 lost years fold gently into that single sentence. 3 hours later, I was seated in the study again, surrounded by lawyers, accountants, and estate managers. The conversation moved in words that felt foreign liquid assets, market portfolios, tax deferments. Someone was explaining the logistics of managing a fortune while I sat there trying to remember how to breathe. I'd spent my life measuring value in grocery bills and overdue notices, and now strangers were describing me as a primary beneficiary. It was like waking from a dream into another dream, one too large to inhabit. When Mitchell finally asked if I had any questions, I could only manage. Why didn't he just tell me if he knew, if he was sure? Why all of this? He leaned back, folding his hands. He was afraid you'd think he was delusional or trying to buy affection. He wanted you to know him first, without the money, without the title. He wanted to be sure you'd see him as a man before you saw him as your father. Patricia nodded softly. He hoped that when the truth came, you'd have memories strong enough to hold it. The idea undid me, because he'd been right if he'd told me at the start. I'd have run. I'd have assumed manipulation, maybe even pity. But instead, I'd seen him as human lonely, complicated, fragile in ways I recognized. And now, all the small gestures of kindness that had seemed like eccentricity, the double wages, the health insurance, the way he insisted I sit with him for dinner flashed in my mind as a quiet, desperate attempt at love. There was one more thing, Patricia said, reaching into her briefcase. He left a specific bequest to an organization he felt deeply indebted to. She handed me a check written to Catholic Charities for $2 million, attached to a handwritten note. For the organization that kept my daughter safe when I couldn't, and for Paul and Ellen Collins, who loved her when I didn't know how. I pressed the paper to my chest, the words bleeding into my heartbeat. Even in death. He'd been making amends, trying to set right the shape of the world he'd left behind. Later that evening, after the last of the lawyers had gone and the mansion fell silent again, I wandered through its halls as though tracing a life I'd never known I belonged to. The portraits stared back like silent witnesses, their painted eyes watching as I turned each corner of my inheritance. In the mirror at the top of the staircase, I caught my reflection and barely recognized the woman standing there, same eyes, same cautious mouth, but a new kind of stillness beneath the surface. Not grief exactly, and not disbelief either. Something older. Something like belonging. I paused by the portrait of Jennifer Walsh, the one hanging in the corridor that led to Terrence's study. Her face was softer than I remembered from the photograph, her smile patient, almost knowing. "I wish you could have seen this," I whispered. "I wish you could have seen me." That night, sleep came in fragments, each dream colored by voices I'd never heard in life, but somehow recognized a young woman's laughter, a man's low hum of regret. When dawn came through the curtains, it took me a few moments to remember where I was. Egyptian cotton. Thick silence. A garden view worth more than the apartment I'd lived in for 20 years. I was Margaret Collins, daughter of Terrence Hawthorne, heir to $63 million, and I had no idea what came next. Then a soft knock at the door. Miss Margaret. Mrs. Chen called, her voice trembling slightly. "There are some people here to see you." The words landed like an omen, because in stories like this, unannounced visitors rarely bring kindness. 3 strangers waited for me in the living room, each wrapped in expensive fabric and colder expressions. The woman in front, silver-haired and sharp-boned, didn't bother to stand when I entered. "Miss Collins," she said, the name rolling off her tongue like a challenge. "I'm Victoria Hawthorne Pierce, Terrence's niece. These are my brothers, Robert and William." The way she said his name, Terrence, felt like she was laying claim to it. I nodded, every instinct warning me that this conversation would not be kind. We need to discuss this situation, she continued, her tone clipped and precise. This alleged inheritance. Alleged, I repeated, surprised at how calm my voice sounded. Victoria smiled thinly. We're suggesting that a convenient deathbed revelation shouldn't automatically entitle you to the family fortune, especially when there are legitimate heirs who have been loyal to Terrence their entire lives. I looked from her to the two men beside her. Robert was heavy-set and impatient, eyes darting like a man searching for exits. William stood perfectly still, polished as glass, the kind of man who believed stillness itself was power. Loyal, I asked, my voice low but steady. Is that what you call showing up after he's gone to contest his will? Robert took a step forward, his jaw tightening. We visited him. Every holiday, every birthday. I almost laughed. And where was I during those years, learning to walk? Graduating high school, raising my own children, burying my husband, living the life he gave me by letting me go. Victoria's mouth curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. You have quite the attitude for someone who just stumbled into $63 million. I could feel Terrence in me, then the quiet steel I'd glimpsed in the way he handled pain, the way he made a sentence sound like law. Let me make this clear, I said, stepping closer until I could see my reflection in her cold blue eyes. I didn't ask for this. I didn't even know I was related to Terrence until yesterday, but he chose to leave me everything, and I won't apologize for his choice. If you have a problem with it, you can take it up with him. For a second, her composure cracked. We intend to, she hissed, in court. 3 days later, Attorney Mitchell confirmed what I already suspected. They've filed to contest the will, he said, his voice measured but tense. Their attorneys are claiming undue influence, manipulation, even fraud. They're arguing you exploited a dying man's weakness. I laughed once, a dry sound that felt older than my bones. They're saying I manipulated him. It's what they do, Patricia said quietly. They throw mud and see what sticks, Mitchell added. Don't worry, the will is solid. The DNA results are clear, and Terrence was of sound mind. But they'll fight. Margaret, they'll drag it through the press if they can. And they did. The headlines arrived like vultures. Caregiver claims, billionaire's fortune, DNA or deception, the Hawthorne inheritance scandal. Each morning, the world seemed to find a new way to doubt my existence. Photographers camped outside the gates. Reporters shouted questions about greed and betrayal. Strangers on the internet decided I was everything from a con artist to a saint. I'd spent a lifetime living quietly, and now my name was being debated by people who'd never heard my voice. One afternoon, while the lawyers sorted through documents, Mrs. Chen came to me pale and trembling. Miss Margaret, she said softly, I need to tell you something. About Miss Victoria. I motioned for her to sit. She looked down at her hands. 6 months ago. When you first arrived, Miss Victoria came here. She was angry. Said Mr. Terrence had hired someone without her approval. I overheard them arguing in his study. My heart began to pound. What did she say? She said she'd done a background check on you. She knew who your birth parents were. I froze. She knew. Mrs. Chen nodded, tears gathering. She told him she'd expose him, that if he told you the truth, she'd have him declared mentally incompetent. She had copies of his medical records. She said she'd use them to prove he was unfit. It felt like the air left the room. Terrence had wanted to tell me. He'd been ready, but Victoria had trapped him, held his dignity hostage while she waited for him to die. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked quietly. Mrs. Chen's face crumpled. She paid me to stay silent. My grandson needed surgery, and I was desperate, but I was wrong. I should have told you. I reached for her trembling hands. You're telling me now. That matters." She met my eyes, her voice firming. "I'll testify. Miss Margaret. She can't hide behind money anymore. Mr. Terrence deserved better. So do you." That night, alone in the study, I unlocked the drawer in Terrence's desk, the one he'd always kept sealed. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written over decades to adoption agencies and private investigators. His handwriting grew weaker with each year but never stopped. And beneath those, more recent documents, bank records, medical reports, correspondence marked with Victoria's initials. She'd been transferring money, limiting his medication, controlling his life under the guise of care, and tucked at the back, a letter addressed simply to Margaret. "If anyone finds this, know that Victoria has been stealing from me. She's threatened to have me declared incompetent if I reveal the truth. But I see everything. I'm keeping these papers safe for you. Don't let her take what belongs to you. You are my daughter. You are everything I hoped for and more than I deserve. Love, Dad." For the first time, I cried not for the years we'd lost, but for the courage it must have taken him to leave me the truth. I pressed the letter to my heart and whispered into the empty room, "I won't let her win." The day of the hearing arrived gray and sharp, the kind of morning that holds its breath before a storm. The courthouse steps were crawling with cameras, the air thick with questions I refused to answer. Inside, the benches were packed reporters, curious onlookers, and the Hawthorne siblings sitting together like an armored wall. Victoria wore confidence like perfume strong, expensive, and suffocating. Her lawyer, a tall man in a navy suit that probably cost more than my first car, opened with practiced outrage. "Your Honor," he said, "this woman preyed upon an elderly man in his final months. She deceived him into believing she was his long-lost daughter in order to secure his fortune." His words dripped poison, and yet I felt strangely calm. I wasn't here to defend greed, I was here to defend truth. When it was our turn, Mitchell stood slowly, letting the silence work for us. "Everything opposing counsel has said is correct about one thing," he began. "Someone did prey upon Terrence Hawthorne, but it wasn't my client." Then he called Mrs. Chen to the stand. She looked small behind the microphone but spoke with the steady dignity of someone who had finally chosen the right side. She told the court about the argument she'd overheard, the threats, the bribe, the way Victoria had known my identity for months. "So," Mitchell asked gently, "Ms. Pierce knew Margaret Collins was Mr. Hawthorne's biological daughter, yet publicly claimed she was shocked by this revelation." Mrs. Chen nodded firmly. "Yes, sir, she knew. She always knew." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. I looked at Victoria, expecting denial, but her expression had hardened into something worse, certainty cracking under its own weight. Mitchell wasn't finished. One by one, he presented the documents we'd found in Terrence's desk, the unauthorized bank transfers, the altered medical reports, the emails to his doctors limiting his care. Each page was a confession in ink. And finally, the letter Terrence had hidden for me, written in his own trembling hand. "Your Honor," Mitchell said, holding it up. Mr. Hawthorne anticipated this moment. In his own words, he names his niece as the one who stole from him, manipulated his treatment, and silenced him through fear. He left these papers to protect the truth and his daughter. The defense lawyer tried to object, but the judge raised a hand. "Let her speak," he said. So I did. My voice was low but clear, steady despite the weight of 60 years. I didn't know who he was when I met him. I didn't know who I was. He hired me because he needed care, and somehow fate put me in front of him. The DNA tests, the records, his own words, they all tell the same story. Terrence Hawthorne found his daughter, and his family tried to keep us apart again, but not this time. The silence that followed was thick enough to hear every heartbeat in the room. Victoria stood, trembling with fury. "You're not family," she spat. "You're a mistake he tried to fix too late." But before her lawyer could pull her back down, the judge's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Enough, Miss Pierce." He flipped through the evidence for several long minutes, then looked up, his expression unreadable. "This court finds that the will is valid and enforceable. The evidence of fraud and elder abuse is overwhelming. I'm ordering a criminal investigation into Miss Pierce's handling of Mr. Hawthorne's finances and medical care." The gavel struck once. The sound was final, like a door closing on a haunted house. For a heartbeat, I couldn't move. Then the relief came slow and deep, like air after drowning. I turned toward the window, where morning light spilled across the bench, and thought of Terrence's last words, "Use it wisely. Use it well." I whispered back, "I will." Outside, the reporters were waiting, their questions circling like birds. One woman shouted, "Mrs. Collins." "What will you do with the inheritance?" I paused, meeting her eyes. "I plan to honor my father's memory," I said simply, "and to help other families find each other, the way we finally did." The words felt right, solid, like they belonged to both of us. 6 months later, the headlines had changed. The Hawthorne siblings were convicted of fraud and elder abuse, serving sentences that couldn't buy their way out of shame. The mansion, my mansion, had transformed. The rooms once filled with silence now hummed with new voices, laughter, stories. The Jennifer Walsh Foundation had become real, a home for adoption reunions, a place for lost families to find their missing pieces. I kept Terrence's study just as he'd left it, the photograph of Jennifer and the locket beside it. Every evening, I'd sit there as the sun faded over the gardens, reading the letters he'd written, but never sent letters where he imagined the life I might have had, the woman I might become. Sometimes I'd whisper to the empty room, "I found you, Dad," and the quiet seemed to answer back, warm and steady, like a heartbeat beneath the floorboards. Because love, I'd learned, doesn't vanish when time runs out. It waits. It endures. It finds a way home. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and in the comments, tell me what would you do if a secret like this found you, because sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money at all, it's truth, and the courage to face it,